I asked you to come on because you'd written this article for The Nation, Friends and Enemies, Marty Peretz and the Travails of American Liberalism, which is a review of this book, The Controversialist, Arguments with Everyone, Left, Right, and Center, by the man himself. And yeah, it's a very it's a very funny article. It's a very it's kind of a fascinating view about this guy. And I know a lot of people probably are watching aren't really particularly familiar with with who Peretz is. It's been like his heyday was a while ago, but one of the sort of things you point out here that might be one way into this is that you say near the beginning of the article, for better and often worse, Peretz has been a force in American life for decades. And his story is not just of one man, but of a politics and an elite that has never quite been able to come to terms with its culpability for triggering the ever-widening crises of the 21st century. And you also point out that the sort of list of this guy's proteges is sort of a rogues gallery of people who everybody watching most definitely does know about, right? Al Gore, Anthony Blinken, Jim Cramer. That was
No. Yeah, I know. And to sort of establish it, I mean, he was the publisher of the New Republic, a sort of standard flagship magazine of American, I would say, technocratic liberalism since its founding in 1914. But he was the publisher from basically 1974 till around 2011. There's a little bit of hiccups towards the end because he had to sell off the magazine. But beyond that, he was also a lecturer at Harvard, and he had kind of created this amazing network. And I think that's perhaps the best way to understand it, that he created a kind of neoliberal network that had a node in Harvard, which is where he would meet a lot of undergraduates, especially, I would say, young male undergraduates, and sort of nurture, or maybe more provocatively groom them into political careers and journalism. And they would go, some of them would work for the New Republic, and some he would encourage to go into politics, and some encouraged to go into Wall Street. And the list of people that he was involved with or knew is really remarkable. You mentioned, I mean, Al Gore would be obviously a name that kind of stands out there. But in the current administration in Washington, he had been a mentor to Anthony Blinken, had been a mentor to Merrick Garland. On Wall Street, he had been a mentor to Michael Milken, to actually quite a few kind of scoundrels in Ivan Boyski, who had been convicted of insider trading, to Michael Steinhardt. He had been very close to Henry Kissinger, very close to Larry Summers, very close to Lloyd Blankfein. So basically, virtually every, and within the world of journalism, his the people he had sort of brought to prominence were people who became fixtures on cable news television, like Michael Kinsley, a co-host for many years of Crossfire, but also Fred Barnes, Morton Kornacki, Charles Krauthammer, a columnist for many years at the Washington Post. And I think a name that's still very relevant is Andrew Sullivan, would have been an editor there. So this is kind of a very remarkable network that had interconnections between Wall Street, Washington, and Harvard, and he was for many years the center of it. And maybe the ideological commonality, I wouldn't say this of everyone he knew,
Sure.
but I'd say like quite a few people. These are bad people.
Yeah, yeah.
These are people whose like main project was to push the Democratic Party to the right, and in that capacity, pushed many of the really terrible programs, the sort of neoliberal turn that started in the 70s, around the time that he took over the New Republic. More arms buildup, paring back the welfare state, the emphasis on policing and the need to police the mass incarceration state, as well as many, many wars. I mean, supporting, in the 1980s, the funding of the Contras, who were like death squads that wreaked havoc in Nicaragua, going up to the Iraq War. And it is like quite the career. And perhaps to give a feeling for this, I will say that there's a remarkable passage in the very early parts of the book where he's talking about the year 2011, when he was supposed to be honored at Harvard University. His 2010. His former students had raised a lot of money to create a sort of fellowship in his name, but then he in the New Republic wrote something quite racist, saying like frankly, Muslim life is cheap, most notably to Muslims. And he asked, whether I need to honor these people, meaning Muslims, and pretend that they are worthy of the privileges of the First Amendment, when I have in my guts the sense that they will abuse the privileges of the First Amendment. And this caused a backlash among Harvard students. Why are we taking money to honor this guy? And so this is like Peretz's account of that moment.
Yeah.
2010. The invasion of Iraq, which I backed, is a disaster. The financial system that my friends helped build has crashed. My wife and I are divorced. The New Republic is sold after I feared going bust. And here I am in my white suit, walking across Harvard Yard, surrounded by students, yelling, "Harvard, Harvard, shame on you," honoring a racist fool. The racist fool is apparently me. It's a sodden coda, one that I can't quite grasp or believe. And I believe I've been told that there's actually footage of this scene of Peretz at that protest. And I would encourage someone to make a clip of that and put on the Curb Your Enthusiasm music. Like this moment, like, wait a minute, am I the racist fool? And I think the book gives ample documentation that he is, that he aside from racism, also a militarist fool, also an elitist reactionary fool, but one who has had enormous influence and was defended by many liberals, was basically until the moment that he lost his the money that he had, which is also, we will get into this, but that's an important part of the story, which is basically his wife's money. So this is a figure
which in an amazing run of good luck was not the first wife with a lot of money.
No. He so basically, but so he was when he was being honored at Harvard, it was like people like Al Gore and the very famous philosopher Michael Walzer, who is considered, not by me, but by other people, like a kind of expert on just war theory. And many other people were there honoring this man and saying he is worthy of being honored. And to their credit, and this is actually a kind of precursor to many of the struggles we're seeing in academia now, the students wouldn't have that. And I should mention another Marty Peretz protege, the investor Bill Ackman, who's been very active right now, trying to destroy as many American universities as he possibly can, in order to clamp down on protests against Israel's war against the people of Gaza.
Michael Walzer, the great philosopher of just war, is also a big advocate of that war, and in fact, I just saw Tim Barker say on Twitter that he had actually asked Walzer point blank, is there anything that Israel could do to make this unjust? And he said no. In his view, which I guess fair enough, if, you know,
well, I mean, this
displacing
is
1.9 million people, you know, doesn't do that. It is very hard to see what would, but yeah.
No, Walter has actually said, this is a, you know, like almost a direct quote, but, you know, like saying, well, you know, taking IDF figures at face value, which one shouldn't do, but saying, okay, there's been like, you know, 35,000 deaths, maybe 10,000 of them are like Hamas militants. Well, that's a good ratio. And that's actually his word, you know, like a good ratio. Which, you know, but I mean, we'll maybe return to Walzer in a bit, but I will say it's always been the critique of Walzer, made most notably by Edward Said, that all his theorizing about just war was done with the idea of creating an intellectual infrastructure that would allow Israel to do what it wants. I think that there's ample reason to think that before. There's even more reason now with what's going on.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I that stuff like that always strikes me as a theory of, you know, waging just war against other people, right?
Yeah.
Like it's, you know, I mean, you know, I think, you know, I think Hamas is very bad, but if, you know, but if you're going to apply the same reasoning, you know, the ratio on 10-7 wasn't even as bad as that, right? You know, so yeah, and I think this does, you know, this is relevant to thinking about, you know, Peretz, because there's the waters he's swimming in. This is certainly, you know, and certainly that kind of advocacy of, you know, not just Zionism, but, you know, but this kind of like really like belligerent, take no prisoners Zionism is a big part of what he stood for over the years, and all of those, you know, racist editorials about Muslims and all of that, to the point that, you know, I mean, you do like, you know, this sort of person now who says, you know, like who wants to be an apologist for everything that Israel does in Gaza, but also wants to present themselves as a reasonable person, will say, well, yes, of course, you know, I want there to be a two-state solution, blah, 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 you know, someday. But one of the more remarkable quotes that you have from, you know, from Peretz in the articles from 1982, when he's speaking to Haaretz about the invasion of Lebanon, and you say Peretz recommended that Israel inflict, quote, a lasting military defeat that will clarify to the Palestinians living in the West Bank that their struggle for an independent state has suffered a setback of many years. Then the Palestinians will be turned into just another crushed nation like the Kurds or the Afghans, you know, two groups, of course, that we haven't heard anything from since.
No. I mean, that is exactly his position on the Palestinians. That they should be a crushed nation. Now, as you say, because of the changing politics, it's no longer polite to say that. And I would say he himself no longer says that. He himself would say he believes in a two-state solution. But if you actually like look at his, like, you know, political record, it is always, you know, the idea of a two-state solution is used as a way of precluding any criticism of what's happening now, saying like, well, we have to go push for the two-state solution. Let's not like get bogged down in criticism of who's killing who. And I see that as a kind of a shell game. It is like, you know, you're holding up this ideal that, you know, like you're not really working towards. It's a bad faith argument. But I mean, maybe but I think it's also an argument that had a lot of resonance among liberals. And I think like my piece, and I think in thinking about Peretz, one has to understand that he is coming from a place of liberalism and even like left liberalism when he started out. And I think that is a story that is perhaps worth charting up, like how someone who in the 60s was an opponent of the Vietnam War, had been like involved in a movement to draft Martin Luther King Jr. to run for a presidential campaign, how we ended up, you know, like being the kind of reactionary that we sketched out. So I think it might be worth, like, you know, rehearsing his like larger life trajectory to get at that story.
Yeah, so let's back up and do that. So he, you know, Peretz doesn't, personally come from poverty, comes from a family that, that has some money, nothing like what you would eventually marry into. But, he certainly sees, you say near the beginning of the article that, that he certainly comes from, a world that's touched by the poverty of others. So he's born in 1938. You describe that world as a claustrophobic, Yiddish-speaking and Shoah-haunted immigrant milieu, far from the American mainstream. That you talk about, like genuinely, gripping passages in his book where, where he's talking about members, of his extended family who were murdered in the Holocaust.
Mm.
And
it should be understood, like, even though his family,
yeah.
I would probably guess, because his father had been a landlord and also owned a factory. I mean, they had money, but I mean, this is the context, 1938. Jews are like still like marginal from the American mainstream in many ways, particularly the kind of East European Jews that he was coming out of. There was an earlier cohort of German American Jews who had been more assimilated, the Oppenheimers of the world.
But yeah, this is a world where there's tons of frank anti-Semitism. Restrictive housing covenants aren't uncommon, all that stuff.
Yeah, that's right. And so, I would say that the Jews, when Peretz was born, like Jews in America, were many white people did not consider Jews to be white. And even in the areas where they might have been accepted, they were maybe more provisionally white, and there was a lot of kind of social stigma and marginalization. I mean, he says, like he's born into a marginal community, and I think like marginal doesn't just refer to like economic distance, but also like like sort of cultural distance. I would say he is like that's an accurate assessment, and I think that explains some of his kind of politics. The fact that he was initially quite attracted to the left, and did see America as a country that needed like a lot of social change. So he's coming from this background, goes to like Brandeis, which is itself a kind of, like a place where Jewish American identity, can stake a claim in mainstream American society. I think there he befriends Michael Walzer, so that's a kind of a crucial connection, and becomes, and then goes to do graduate work at Harvard, where he, like, is never really an academic in a real sense. A lot of the time, his position was lecturer, and his like the academics at Harvard basically say, you're not really a scholar, but we like to have you around. And reading between the lines, I think they like to have him around because he had money, and therefore he could like bring money into the university and also get jobs for his students. And so that's like valuable. But in any case,
and to be fair, I mean, he's also a popular lecturer. People like his classes.
Yeah, he's a very popular lecturer. Yeah, and so with Walzer, he is part of this kind of like burgeoning new left that is very concerned with civil rights, and with like anti-war movement. Initially in the early '60s with like sort of nuclear proliferation issues, and then later with the Vietnam War. And he also refers to the Harvard as, he describes it as a Harvard patriot. That and Harvard is very special to him, and it is, like, if one sees it as a story of assimilation, it is where he, this child of this marginal community, really gets into the gates are open for the American elite, and this happens through his like two marriages, one of which is very brief, and but to a woman who is like wealthier than he is, whose family has citrus money from Miami, and it is very good at socializing and really introduces him to the world of like parties, where he starts throwing parties where like people like the famous columnist Max Lerner or the actress Shelley Winters show up, and it really shows him the power that can come from being a socialite, being able to bring people together. And then later, that marriage doesn't last very long, and it's actually while he was married to his first wife that he meets Anne Devereux Lebois Farnsworth, uh, who is like not just like
It's a
wealthy.
great string of names. Yes.
But and a very wasp name, right?
Yeah.
But he says she's not quite a Rockefeller, but it's in that territory, right?
Yeah.
And the story I tell in my article is when she was growing up, her grandfather was a collector of paintings, and there was a painting that she particularly liked, and she would often go visit it, and she ended up while at Bard writing a paper about it. And then the grandfather, knowing that she loved the painting, left it to her in his will, and that was a Rembrandt. Right.
Yeah.
This is a family where you can literally be given a Rembrandt by your granddad.
Yeah.
And by the way, just to close the loop on that story, that Rembrandt is now in Tel Aviv. The Peretzes donated it to the Israeli National Museum.
There you go. Yeah.
But I mean, so Anne Peretz is shares her family, the family money comes from the Singer sewing machine fortune, and the sewing machine was one of the first really large scale capitalist mass produced items, far before the automobile, right? And it really revolutionized one of the basic items of humanity is clothing, right? We all have to wear clothing. And the sewing machine revolutionized clothing and took over the world. There was sewing machines all over the place. And like a lot of early capitalist enterprises, it's based on really primitive capital accumulation of
you say in the article, there's sort of any fortune on this magnitude that, you wrote a term paper about this painting, why don't you have it, is likely to be rooted in some kind of brutal primitive accumulation. And so here you have all kinds of union busting and, you know,
Singer family fortune, a lot of union busting. They were also pioneers of what's called Taylorism, the use of so-called scientific management that would, basically about controlling every waking moment of your employee's life. The sort of stuff that we see in Amazon today, Amazon factories, was pioneered by Anne Peretz's ancestors, and the family had all this kind of unsavory qualities of the very wealthy. I think one of her relatives, I believe it's an uncle, actually was plotted the coup d'etat against Franklin Roosevelt. He's the one who he was part of this, along with the DuPonts. That they wanted to hire General, I believe, Smedley Butler.
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
to try to overthrow Franklin Roosevelt because he's raising their taxes too much. So Anne Peretz, to her credit,
right,
did not felt guilt about that aspect of her heritage, and Peretz, coming out of the New Left, seemed like someone who could they could work with.
You say that, you quote Peretz saying that she felt like there was money raining down on her all the time. And she didn't know what to do with it, and of course he had lots of ideas about what to do with it, which were initially pretty beneficial, right?
No.
Various kinds of left liberal causes. You mentioned earlier that in 1967, right? So this would have been for the 68 election, right? They wanted to draft Dr. King to run as a third party candidate. And then actually, I guess I did want to dig into this a little bit, because in the article, you sort of say that the conference that got together to promote this, the New Politics Conference, you sort of say it went badly. This was a big turning point, but I think maybe in that context you didn't have the space to get into it that much.
No. I'm really glad you mentioned that, because that is actually, I think, the sort of the New Politics Conference in Chicago in '67 is a kind of very big turning point. And so Peretz had been involved with civil rights, with anti-war, after the attempt to recruit Dr. King didn't turn out, and in fact Dr. King was assassinated the following year. He and Anne Peretz were the largest single donors to Eugene McCarthy's insurgent campaign to unseat Lyndon Johnson and run on an anti-war politics. He also gave a lot of money to Ramparts magazine, which was like quite a left-wing magazine. Most notable at the time, they were the ones who basically broke a very important story about the CIA funding all sorts of cultural institutions. Yeah, no, they were coming out of the left. This New Politics Conference is now, I mean, the idea was that they were going to bring in various disparate elements of the new left and get them behind Dr. King, and I believe they wanted Benjamin Spock, Dr. Spock, to be the vice presidential candidate. The conference turned very ugly, very bad. Now, Peretz alleges that a lot of the New Left people were anti-Semites. I wouldn't deny that there might have been some of that, although a lot of the people he names as anti-Semites are in fact Jewish. I mean, they're Jewish leftists who are critical of Israel, right? Like,
right. Yeah, I mean, like, look, as always, right? I mean, it's a little bit complicated because it's like, look, nobody needs to convince me that like anti-Semitism is a thing that exists in the world, and it would, and it's like statistically impossible for it not to manifest itself on the left. But like, also, like, this is just something that you cannot talk about without just confronting this like crazy sea of false positives.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I mean, I'm absolutely. I mean, if you look at all the people he, labels as like anti-Semites or Jew haters, or often he calls them self-hating Jews, because a lot of them are Jews, and it is basically a divide between, the old internationalist left-wing Jews who want to apply to Israel the same standards that they apply to like any other country, versus Jewish nationalists, of which Peretz was, one. And so in a lot of ways, I think Israel is the kind of great sticking point. Like, he could not abide by the kind of, left-wing critique, often made, not always, but, often made by left-wing Jews of Israel.
Yeah, okay. and I mean, this also makes sense for 1967, right? I mean, because just in terms of like the sort of larger, from like, look, I mean, when Israel's founded, it's like it's founded in alliance with the Soviet Union. There's like a sort of widespread kind of lefty sympathy in the 50s and 60s, and I think that awareness of the Nakba and all of that is just not that widespread at that time in most of these circles. And but 1967 is getting right into where like the sort of immediate politics of this make that harder and harder to sustain.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I forget if it was like immediately before, immediately after, but Anne Peretz and Marty Peretz were like literally married like right around the time of the 6-Day War. So I mean, that is like kind of like a foundational moment, and it is. So I mean, I there was a sense, that, and I have to say, like, in some ways, maybe it's almost being precautious or like thinking ahead, because the actual New Left, if you look at it, like a lot of the people in the New Left were not that anti-Israel. In fact, were very, even themselves, very pro-Zionist. There was a few who were. I was more like the older left of people like Chomsky and I.F. Stone. But anyways, Peretz started to realize that this is going to be a real issue. But the other issue,
and by the way, I mean, you mentioned I.F. Stone, like, just to kind of put a bow on the Peretz's like throwing around the money for good reasons, before, I mean, just a few years before we're talking about, right? You mentioned that he bought a full page ad in the New York Times to print I.F. Stone's like article denouncing the Gulf of Tonkin resolution.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And then I have shown, for listeners who might not be up on the history, it was like independent journalist, basically blacklisted everywhere. He had his own newsletter, like Substack, before there was Substack, and he was like one of the like really accurate and visionary critics of the Vietnam War, like from very early on, basically documenting. Like that a lot of the stuff the Pentagon was saying were demonstrable lies. And I mean, Peretz, to his credit, sponsored that. But in the context of the New Politics Conference, one thing was that the division the contradictions of being a wealthy sponsor of a left-wing movement really came to the fore at that conference. And one of it was just like a matter of space that the conference was held. I forget even the name of the place, but it was like a really rundown Fleabag hotel in downtown Chicago, where Peretz himself would not deign to set foot in or to like stay in, and so he went to like a more fancy place, and he sort of said, like that prevented me from like really taking charge the way I should. But also, and this is a quote: nobody cared at the New Politics Conference whether I was there or not. I had no clout at all, he complains. And then he said he was simply seen as a money bag. And so the idea was that like it's not just that these left-wing radicals are too critical of Israel. It's not just that the black radicals don't want to be led by white leadership, but it's also the fact that his money isn't buying him clout. It's not buying him what he wanted, which is to be the leader. It's not buying him respect, right? And this is there's a guy named Henry. In my article, I talk about various cases of his charitable giving. One of which is that when Susan Sontag had cancer, he and Anne gave a lot of money. And also, there was a journalist at Henry at the New Republic named Henry Fairley, a staff writer, but like a real classic ne'er-do-well British journalist. He actually couldn't go back to Britain because the Lady Anatonia Fraser had a libel suit against him after he called her a prostitute on the BBC. So he lived in America, often very poor, basically unhoused. He slept on the New Republic's couch, more than once. And then in the early 80s, he needed heart surgery, and so Anne and Peretz, paid for the heart surgery. And so Henry Fairley, in talking about Peretz, in an interview with Esquire, said that the giving of money and the desire for gratitude are really his story, right? He says, Peretz had his fingers burned. He said the worst people to raise money for were the left. And then he had Fairley added, it's an incredible thing about the rich; they need to be loved. And
this is and you actually, one of the parts of the article that I like the most is when you're talking about this and you I think essentially make the point that look, the personal generosity and the opposition to redistribution go hand in hand, right? Because you want to be the one who's in charge of deciding how the money is spent, who's a worthy beneficiary, that you want to get the credit, right?
That's right. That's right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, you're not giving away your wife's money for nothing.
Exactly.
So and so I think that is like the crucial aspect. This kind of paradox of having wealthy people in charge of an egalitarian social movement, right? Like at some point something's got to give, and for Peretz, it's he realized that well, if the left really means it, if they really mean to create a world where I'm not going to get respect because I'm married a near billionaire, is that really what I want? And so I think that he stays on the left, with some left-wing causes, for a little while after that. But he really, I think that moment is a really crucial one, and I think that it explains both his real turn to the right, and also I think the particular nature of his racism towards African Americans, which is the sort of racism of the wounded white savior.
Right.
I wanted to help you people. I wanted to we could have had something good. I was willing to write the checks. All you had to do was show a little respect. And the sort of animosity that really runs through his later writings and the stuff that he published. I think it came from that 1967 moment. And with the sense that
which is interesting because there's an obvious point of comparison here to the classic neocons, the, like your Norman Podhorances and people like that, who in some ways have a very similar, like, drift away from, at least the liberal left, to what they became. And, the end destination is a little bit different. You point out like the New Republic, even when it was sort of advocating most of the worst things that happened in the 80s and 90s, was at least like, at least they wanted marriage equality, right? So it's not straight down the line conservatism. But like one thing that does strike me is that I think a lot of the classic neocons, I get the sense that like the sort of first breaking point with the left oftentimes did have to do with like race and crime and issues like that. Like reading your article, it seems like the order might have been a little bit different with Peretz. But that was certainly always in the mix.
Yeah, no. I mean, I think that it's a very similar story, and it might be useful to think about like why he's not quite a neocon. But I mean, I think that with him in particular, although I think some of the neocons, I mean, it's worth remembering that the Commentary of the 1960s was also a pro-civil rights magazine under Norman Podhoretz. And, like Podhoretz and Midge Decter, even though it's incredible to think this now, were friends with Bayard Rustin, who, wrote for the magazine, wrote very important pieces in Commentary. But it is the sense of, it's what they always say is we were mugged by reality, which is kind of like a racially loaded metaphor. And I have to say, there's some of that with Peretz, particularly, focus on what he considers, the problem of Black crime and a Black social dysfunction. But there's also, I mean, in my sense of it, it's more particularly that 67 moment of like, I was, willing to go to the bat where you really wanted to, be at the head of the leader of this movement, and you didn't accept me. The sense of rejection, which I don't quite get from the other neocons. I think theirs is more like, really a sense of there's limited pie in America. You have to divide up the pie, and if we start giving more to blacks, we give affirmative action. There's going to be less for us. Well, which Peretz also, eventually has. He becomes very like,
I mean, there is. Horace is very mad that everybody disliked making it, but yeah, that's
dislike making. And in fact, I mean, with Peretz, I mean, if you think about it, classically, he comes from he really comes from a working class background, right? Like sort of Brownsville, and his whole thing is that classic essay, "My Negro Problem in Art." Right. Which he basically says, like, quite incredibly, like, he went to school with like Black kids, and like they were the ones who were top. They ran the school. They could bully like dirty kids like me. So like, why are we thinking that they're like the underdogs? I'm the underdog. And I don't quite get. I mean, it is more like with Peretz. It is a more sense of wounded noblesse oblige. But I mean, yeah, I mean, the bringing the neocons is very important, though, because there is that larger trajectory of American life of people who are coming out of sort of Cold War liberalism. And, like, he always had very strong anti-communist principles, but also Cold War liberalism, I think it's too easy for the left to dismiss this now, did have like a component of like social welfare. It was Lyndon Johnson politics, more guns, more bread, more butter, and civil rights. And, like once the contradictions of the New Deal order came under crisis, and once you had the sort of 1970s economic downturn, where you no longer had that spectacular economic growth, then it became an issue of how many slices of the pie are there going to be, who's going to get it. And then a lot of these Cold War liberals, like Podhoretz, they turned to the right, said, I got mine. Like if we keep redistributing, that means that those of us who came from white working class backgrounds are going to get less. We can't have that. So whereas So Peretz had and they all turned to the right on both supporting militarism, cutting back the welfare state. That is also Peretz's trajectory, but coming from a place, first of all, of great wealth, and also, and this is the other biographical detail that we did mention, also raises all sorts of questions about the two marriages to very wealthy heiresses, which is in this book, written in when he's like in his early 80s.
Maybe the most memorable line in the review is you say, married one wealthy heiress is a great stroke of luck. Married two raises questions.
Raises questions, especially since if you are, as Marty Peretz, it says in this book, he says, I'm gay. He identifies for the first time. There had been long-standing rumors to this effect, going back decades, but for the first time, he publicly says he's gay. He doesn't say, I'm bisexual, right? I'm a gay man, well, he doesn't name any male lovers, but he's still discreet about that. So, he's a closeted gay man, twice married to very wealthy women. I don't want to be purist or anything like that, but this does kind of raise.
There is a pretty obvious interpretation of what's going on here.
Although it could have also been. That's also what maybe Anne wanted. There are ways in which that's sort of it's a pre-Stonewall pattern, which one sees it, sort of like Leonard Bernstein's marriage, or the marriage of the novelist Samuel Delany with Marilyn Hacker, where Delany was initially identified as bisexual, but eventually as gay, and Marilyn Hacker eventually identified as being a lesbian. But so these kind of marriages of kind of convenience within their framework where anything like gay marriage was out of the question, right? Okay, so a young Marty Peretz might marry a wealthy heir rather than an heir.
That's right. Which to be fair,
is progress.
He actually did advocate for, which takes us to the other sort of point of difference with the neocons, that even though the overall trajectory in both cases is from more guns, more butter to more guns and less butter. And they certainly all stood shoulder to shoulder, supporting everything from Israel's invasion of Lebanon to the Contra death squads in Nicaragua to eventually the Iraq War. But the neocons, some of them have shifted back more recently because of the politics of Trump. But the neocons, over the course of this time period, shifted to the Republican Party, whereas you said earlier in our discussion, the sort of overall project of Peretz as he does this turn, and of the New Republic when he buys it in 1974 onwards, is to shift the Democratic Party to the right, right?
Which is arguably, I think, more important. I think the neocons gave a certain intellectual sheen to Reaganism, but you don't need to teach Reagan to build more weapons. Welfare state. He already believed that, right? That's even more important. The neoliberals were more important than the neocons. The neoliberals were the one that changed the Democratic Party and therefore changed the rules of what's possible. But it is true that he did the New Republic, always pro-choice.
Right.
But I would never describe it as a strongly feminist magazine. In fact, it's kind of notorious for not having a lot of female editors, and for its book review section. I believe it's Emily's List, or there's a service that monitors, who reviews the gender quotient of various publications, and their book review section was notoriously 90% men of reviewers and reviewed. And then Leon and the longtime editor of book review section, Leon Wieseltier, was accused of sexual harassment by multiple women. And in fact, this is kind of in the autobiography. Anne Peretz apparently had told Marty Peretz, you got to rein Leon in. He's kind of running wild, and Marty Peretz's attitude is, boys will be boys. You have to kind of Leon's a genius. Genius has its privileges.
Yeah, right.
No. So, but then the other feminist aspect,
Yeah,
yeah. So, like, but it's feminist of a liberal feminism of the Democratic Party, pro-choice. Although I
right.
think they also wrote a, they would publish these contrarian articles about, like, well, do we really need Roe v. Wade? And maybe it was badly decided, but we leave that
Sure.
aside. And also the gay politics. Now he says that they hired Andrew Sullivan, who was the first. He represents as the first openly gay editor of an important magazine, and I guess a lot of that hinges on what you define as
Important
important.
magazine. Yeah,
But I think that passage actually is inaccurate and actually shows how cut off he was from actual gay
right.
culture. Because certainly, like at the Nation where I work, Andrew Kopkind was an editor before Andrew Sullivan, and Kopkind was very openly gay. Vanity Fair and Art Forum and the Village Voice all had openly gay editors. So I kind of think, but I mean, he thinks of Andrew Sullivan as I
Right.
think that maybe Sullivan leaves a more of an impression
I mean, you're also,
because he's very mainstream, right? He went
yeah,
to
yeah, yeah,
Harvard, he worked for the New Republic, and he created a kind of conservative gay identity that was very palatable to the elite. Where he said, we want gay marriage, but we're not all into that, queer stuff. We're not into, like,
yeah, right,
and it was very critical of ACT UP and very critical of, especially ACT UP on their tendency to out people who were, like, hypocritical, like, say, Roy Cohn or
right.
figures like that, right? Gay Republicans who were, like, virulently homophobic.
Yeah,
There's a real controversy: should you out those people or not against their will? And the New Republic took the side: no, we have to prevent the sanctity of the closet and people's
yeah,
privacy. And, like, if you think about it, like, so the position that's outlined is, like, that Andrew Sullivan crafted. Although I'm sure he sincerely believed all this, like, it totally favored the guy who's paying his bills, because it was like,
yeah,
we want gay rights, but like, let's keep the closet for those who
yeah.
want
Don't
the
out
closet,
Marty.
right?
Right.
Huh?
Yeah. No, for sure. So okay. So I mean, the New Republic under Peretz, like, has a certain kind of baseline social liberalism.
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
it's a, it's a,
I would say a
it's kind of it's a,
minimalist social liberalism of
yeah.
the
I
sort
mean,
of Democratic Party kind.
yeah, exactly, right. So it's a kind of social liberalism that's, like, typical maybe of the Democratic, a party in this, in the era in which they were helping to shape the Democratic Party, like,
Yeah.
better in
It's
some
sort of
ways, not as bad in others.
Clintonian social liberalism, right? Like,
Yeah,
like sort of, feminism for as a project of, like, opening up the workplace and
right.
creating positions for elite women.
Well, so
And
this is
yeah,
this yeah, because this, I think, actually gets to the part that's in some ways most interesting to me, because because if you think about that sort of combination of positions, right? There's the there's a embrace of American empire, and
yeah,
and the relationship between that and the Zionist projects and all of that we were talking about. But this is all happening within the Democratic Party, and there is this kind of baseline social liberalism that's sort of very imperfect in this Clintonian kind of way. And but that, like, in some ways, the most interesting part to me is the economic part.
yeah,
The less butter part, because it seems like that's like a kind of underlies
yeah.
a lot of this, right? I mean, this is so this is a project of I mean, whatever else he is, he's a very rich guy who bought who bought a magazine, who was frustrated about not having clout right at the New Politics Conference in '67. By '74, he's bought what he views as his new very important magazine, much more important than the Nation or whatever, and as we just established, and he is and he he has proteges on Wall Street, all of that stuff. And it seems like a lot of what the New Republic is up to on these issues, both influences Clintonism,
Mhm.
which is as you say, I mean, in some ways is a way more important development than the like any role the neocons were really having, inside the Republican Party. And that sort of same spirit is that famous quote, or I don't know, supposed quote from Margaret Thatcher, where she's asked what her most important legacy is, and she says New Labour.
Yeah, no, absolutely, yeah. And in fact, in the name of Margaret Thatcher, reminds me of something very important, which is, so I mean, a lot of the New Republic journalists want to become celebrities. One of which is Michael Kinsley, who was on Crossfire against Pat Buchanan, and so Pat Buchanan from the right, and Buchanan is like Franco-loving fascist, right?
Yeah.
Michael Kinsley, like he has said, like his in the 80s, he said his favorite politician was Margaret Thatcher, and he was critical of Reagan for not having like the real intellectual honesty of a Thatcher, who would raise taxes and actually cut the debt, and he was like much more austerity minded than Reagan was. So I mean, like you're creating a political spectrum where, like, on the one hand you have like pretty avowed fascist, like celebrating Father Coughlin and Joseph McCarthy and Franco. And the liberal side is the admirers of Margaret Thatcher. And furthermore, the finance is very important. So he, one of the institutions that he helped create and was a big part of was the Democratic Leadership Council, which was designed to make the Democratic Party move towards a more centrist direction. They were the ones that encouraged, sponsored like Bill Clinton and Al Gore, and a lot of it came from like Wall Street money, which Peretz had access to, more sort of Southern, the kind of now extinct species of Southern white Democrats who are like more conservative, and these kind of like Peretz style Zionist, who wanted the party to be right for the sake of Israel. And he praises in the book, Bill Clinton as, quote, friendly to finance. And this is idea really says, like deregulation of Wall Street, like letting the finance markets, the financialization of America, this is all to be desirable. And it has an actual real impact in terms of the people, the financiers that he's involved with, because they are, a lot of these are unfortunately kind of forgotten figures, but people like Ivan Boisky and Michael Milken, they were like at the spearhead of like financial innovation in the 1980s, of creating junk bonds, like really insider trading, really like pushing the limits, and like both Boisky and Milken would suffer criminal penalties for that, and also Michael Steinhardt, who was another Peretz friend, who wasn't engaged with that, but trafficked in antiquities. He's actually now barred from traffic in antiquities because he was like buying all sorts of stolen loot from the Middle East. So like it's not just like, okay, this is not like, we're not talking about Frederick Hayek here of like, the free market is the best economy. We're talking about like actual criminals, right?
Right. Yeah.
Who are like getting wealthy and then like able to like direct money through Peretz to the Democratic Party, to push the Democratic Party to the right on economics, and that is the kind of bedrock position. And as I said, one should try to be generous and say, well, like no one is all bad. And then the story I tell at the beginning of my review is Susan Sontag, very great intellectual, but like many Americans, no healthcare. She's like a freelance writer, and when she had cancer,
prestige doesn't actually pay for operations.
No, absolutely. She needed a very expensive experimental operation from a Parisian doctor, which actually saved her life. Gave her like an extra 3 decades of her life. She Peretz, he didn't know Susan Sontag, but his other wealthy friends, let's see, who was it? It was Bob Silvers of the New York Review of Books, and Roger Strauss of Forrest, Strauss and Giroux, who I believe was married to a duchess, but in any case, like well-to-do people, they gathered around, they helped her, and like as with the Henry Fairley story, this is like the good things that wealthy people can do in the society. But like I would rather not live in a society where people's your healthcare choice depends on whether Marty Peretz decides you're worthy of his charity or not. Like
yeah.
don't
To
think
put it
that's
to say the least. And this actually brings us to like the first of a couple of big controversies the New Republic is involved with in the 90s that I think say a lot about this kind of neoliberal politics they helped engineer. Which is that as much as we've been talking about the connections, the ways that the New Republic again becoming super influential, right? There's a period where people would joke about they would call it the in-flight magazine of Air Force One, but in this case, the first case, they're pushing back against something that the Clinton administration is doing, which is the Hillary Care, healthcare reform attempt, which is, which I think is, was not exactly, a piece of bold radicalism.
No.
To put it mildly, right? I mean, this was like, if anything, I think if you go back and look at what was actually being proposed, I mean, it, was like a lot of ways it anticipated Obamacare, but this is if you read like Christopher Hitchens' book about the Clintons, he's I think appropriately scathing about this sort of like ultimately very corporate friendly healthcare reform that he's talking about. But even so, this was going way too far, certainly for the right, and in 1994, even for the New Republic.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, and this is actually an interesting development, like in the sort of 1990s, where they kind of, I mean, they got everything they wanted, right? Like they got Bill Clinton as president, and he shares like all their kind of like ideological predilections. But then the impulse is never enough, right? So the impulse was to move like even further to the right, which is, I think, an interesting development of the New Republic in those kind of Clinton years. Because like Andrew Sullivan, like leaving aside the issue of marriage equality, was a pretty standard, like Tory. Again, a huge fan of Margaret Thatcher, and so that incident really shows how the New Republic kind of functioned to legitimize and amplify right-wing voices. Because like Peretz brought in this woman, Betsy McCowie, who was at the Manhattan Institute, like a right-wing neocon think tank, and she wrote this like huge statement called "No Eggs," an article for the New Republic, cover article, basically saying that this would like deny people like access to like their doctors and would destroy American healthcare. Now, as you said, I mean, I don't want to say this like in a defense of Hillary Clinton, because there are ways in which there were critiques from the left of that proposal. But this No Exit was basically a very dishonest attack, and was attacked as dishonest, in the New Republic as elsewhere. I mean, in the New York Times as elsewhere. And there's a couple of interesting developments. One of which is that I mean, Peretz is in defending himself. He would say, "Well, I'm trying to stir up debate and have an argument." Well, the best critique of that article in the pages of the Republic came 15 months after the original article, right? By Mickey Kaus. Again, not a left winger at all, but like he really did show that she actually fundamentally misread the Hillary Clinton healthcare proposal, and like was saying that it had strictures that it did not have. Now at that point, the article had already been like got hugely amplified, and people were basically, this was the sort of shell game that the magazine played, because it's a right-wing article, but it appeared in the New Republic in a liberal magazine that supported Clinton, and some people were saying, and they like Rush Limbaugh and George Will were celebrating this article, saying, "Look, even the liberal New Republic is saying that Hillary Care is like a Stalinist, totalitarian
kind of a joke at the time, right?
Yeah,
that, like, the primary function of the New Republic was to let people start sentences with even the New Republic, right?
That's right. Yeah. Now, so the magazine, the article. And this is something that's not in my review, but I'll mention this because I think your listeners will be interested. The article won like a National Magazine Award, and it credited it with like stopping Hillary Care and having a big policy impact. And then the Mickey Koss article came out later, which basically, like, argued that this article was like based on falsehood. It was wrong, and it's in the same magazine. So one of the judges who had awarded that prize wrote a letter to the New Republic saying, like, what's going on here? Like, if I knew that you guys were not going to stand by your article and were like, as a magazine, you're supposed to like do fact checking, and you're supposed to be like take a a position. You can have like debate about like ideas, but like on basic factual matter, you're supposed to have a position, right? And one of those articles could be true. Either the original No Exit article could be true, or Mickey Koss's critique could be true, but both cannot be true. Like, just logically, like one or the other, right? And so this judge for the National Magazine Award said, like, I would not have given that award if I knew this. It's very intellectually dishonest, makes me think much less of the magazine. Now, the New Republic did not run that letter.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
Which gets to this issue of like, there's a lot of Peretz's thing, like, well, we supported the Contras, but we had anti-Contra articles. I was trying to have a debate. We published, the bell curve on a race and IQ, but we had criticisms of it. We were trying to start a debate, but in each and every case, the debate is like crafted in such a way that, first of all, the false argument gets pride of place, gets prominence, gets really promoted, and the critiques are either like come belatedly, are like less sharp, and also sometimes are not even aired, as in this case. Right. They did not publish this devastating letter from a judge who had awarded them a prize, saying that like that should not have happened.
Yeah, I mean, this is right. So I mean, they. It's one thing to have a debate, but the question is what the parameters of the debate are, how it's conducted, right? Yeah, no, absolutely.
I should actually encourage people to. I think you probably, if you Google it, look it up. But there's an article in The Believer by someone I think Andy Lamey, who a philosopher in San Diego. But he wrote about The Believer, about this whole issue, and he documented everything I've just kind of said here. So it's worth looking up.
Yeah, and talk of the bell curve. I mean, that's one of the other controversies I want to talk about here, because both because of what it illustrates about that dynamic that you're talking about the way that the New Republic is in a certain sense promoting debate, but it's that there's in some ways in a very disingenuous way, but also because of what it says about the sort of larger politics of like New Republic style neoliberalism, right? Because they, like the the bell curve. I mean, so the extract that was published, and this is sort of the most notorious part of the bell curve, like the most notorious chapter is the one where they say, that suggests that that black people are cognitively inferior to white people, and it can't be explained by sociological factors, etc. Right? I mean, that's they have Murray and Hertzstein always had like sort of more slightly more dressed up ways of saying it, but that's the core argument, right? Yeah. And but I also think like, okay, because that was so kind of, shockingly vile, I think that, that kind of became the lightning rod for all discussion, about the bell curve, and what, and I think what often gets missed, at least in my memory of that book, is that, this is Murray and Hertzstein sort of being consistent enough to follow through the ugly racial implications of their more general claim, which is that like poor people are cognitively inferior, to middle class and rich people, right? Like this is the, and I seems to me that like even a lot of this debate about the bell curve. I mean, okay, so there's obviously like there's obviously like the empirical debate, right? Which is where the sort of disingenuous framing becomes most important, that like this is presented as being much more serious and scholarly than it actually is. This is like Murray's like a right-wing think tank guy, that's
I want to just say something about that, because I think that and then take up you about the sort of larger politics of the bell curve. I think it's very important. So, I mean, the bell curve was presented as a kind of like, a scientific statement. And this is the whole rhetoric of Charles Murray and Richard Herrnstein in that book. Like, well, we're just guys in lab coats. We're just scientists. These are the findings. We might not like them. You might not like them. But, guess what? Poor people and Black people in particular, they just don't got the brains. Like us smart folks do. Now, but first of all, like, Murray, his entire career as a was not with academia, within these right-wing think tanks, which, were paying him money to come to certain conclusions. And the Wall Street Journal, actually, in their journalistic function, had a really great article about the bell curve when it first came out, about the marketing campaign. And what they noted was that the marketing campaign was designed to get maximum attention without scientific scrutiny. So this is a purportedly scientific book, right? Now, usually if you have a scientific book, you send it out to peer review. That's what an academic publication would do. Like the Oxford University Press, if you send them the bell curve, they would send it out to scholars, and they'd come back with comments, right? It's done through a trade publisher, not sent to for peer review, and in fact kept from any scientific journal until after publication, and with a lot of money spent on getting promotion. And so, before the book came out, there's a huge profile of Murray in the New York Times Magazine. Like, that's something you only get from like a marketing budget of several $100,000.
Right.
The New Republic was part of this, because they excerpts had been published in Commentary and National Review, where both writers had published before. That didn't matter. Like, that's what you would expect from those guys. That's what they've been saying. That's what National Review was saying from the moment of its founding. Like in William Buckley's famous, where it's like the white race is for now the superior race, whatever. To be published in the New Republic, to have that published in the New Republic was an event. It was a media event, right? Like, even the liberal New Republic says Black people are inferior. The second thing is, there was a staff revolt. Like, only Andrew Sullivan and Marty Peretz wanted to publish those. Everyone else in the magazine didn't. So the compromise was they published this long excerpt, that chapter you mentioned, and then they had rebuttals. But the thing with the rebuttals is, they were all from people in the magazine who were journalists, and some of them, were very sharp. Again, Mickey Koss, I will give him credit. He wrote, very sharp, really sharp critique. But only one of the rebuttals came from someone who was in the actual field of sort of psychology and cognitive science, Richard Nesbitt, who wrote a good critique. But the others were all kind of, literary journalist type, and some of the arguments that they made were terrible. And I just want to quote Leon Wieseltier's comments about the bell curve, because he's being a critic, but tell me if this is a good critique. Murray does not see that he's encouraging the ethnocentric algorithm of African Americans in a direction of decline. When Snoop Doggy Dogg commands the attention that Johnny Hodges once commanded, there has occurred a decline. When Toni Morrison commands the attention that Ralph Ellison once commanded, there has been a decline. So what he's basically saying is, the problem with Murray is he's too accepting of Black culture, because he's saying, oh, that's just the way people are. Let them have their hip hop. Whereas, Leon Wieseltier, the enlightened liberal, realized that the once great Black culture of the jazz I loved has gone into decline, and we have this gibberish rap music, and the once great novels of Ralph Ellison have declined into Toni Morrison. And then this is very much in keeping with Leon Wieseltier's book review section, which was notorious among Black writers in the 90s as this is the section that will always go after Black writers and attack them in the harshest and sometimes the most dishonest ways possible. People like Cornel West, Toni Morrison, Skip Gates, and then, by the way, in the case of not flaming radicals necessarily, but so I mean, the critique of the bell curve was that it was not focusing enough on Black cultural decline,
right?
Which I don't think that's a great critique, To be honest,
no, sure, very much so. But
yeah,
like,
so I mean that gets the larger racial politics.
because if you think about those politics, right? I mean, you said like, okay, so when the publishers, the bell curve, are going around, handing extracts, advanced copies to friends but not enemies. That, like, of course, their, National Review goes out saying, you quoted the, sort of infamous racist editorial from the civil rights era. But even there, right? I mean, I think it is interesting thinking about how the two issues intersect there, because like think about like William F. Buckley at his most openly racist in the civil rights era, right? Like he did a debate at either Oxford or Cambridge with James Baldwin, and there's a point in that debate where he sort of says, yes, okay, maybe things are hard for black people because of racism, fine, but what are we supposed to do? And one of the students heckles him and yells out, you could let them vote in Mississippi. And his sort of winning, witty response is to draw, well, if it were up to me, most of the white people in Mississippi wouldn't be able to vote either, which got a laugh in the room. But it's like, this is like, that's his defense, right? He sort of hates all the pearls equally, right? And this is, and then you think about the debate, like the politics, the debate about the bell curve at the New Republic. This is the sort of the racial aspect of it is a bridge too far for many people there, right? This is there's that staff revolt you're talking about, but because they still hold on to a kind of liberalism where you say, okay, at least the sort of distribution of poverty in America, that there's some injustice here because it reflects this history of racial oppression. So you do at least maybe need to correct that. You don't want to just attribute that part to genetics. But the sort of larger claim that the poors are inferior, and that's why they're poor, right? Like it seems much less controversial. And even the so you mentioned like the good guy at the New Republic in both of the stories that we just went over, right? The Hillary Care story and the bell curve story is Mickey Kaus. But even though Mickey Kaus is on the right side of these two issues, right, and so is sort of an important representative of like where the parameters of debate at the New Republic are set. This is actually a guy who is a sort of big intellectual exponent of liberals giving up on caring about economic equality.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, no. His book, and I actually do think, I mean, again, to give him credit, I actually think this is a lot of the Republic guys were just journalists. He wrote, like, I think the most sort of theoretically advanced statement of their politics, and really tried to give it a kind of a basis in intellectual debate. It's a book called The End of Equality, basically saying, we used to have money liberalism, the liberalism of FDR and Lyndon Johnson, where you tried to give people more money, but that's not working. And he basically it's an argument from futility.
Right.
Basically saying, like globalization, economics being what they are, unions aren't going to come back. Welfare money doesn't actually hurts the poor. We can't have money inequality. But to replace that, he wants to have something called, civic equality. Which is to have let's have a little bit of respect for each other. Let's have maybe like a national program where everyone has to plant trees or whatever. Create civic spaces where we can have some.
I mean, I can't hear the stuff about respect without thinking of the was it Don Draper fighting with Peggy, and says, so you never say thank you, and he says that's what the money is for, right? It's like I think respect is much more convincing when it's attached to actually a bigger share of society's resources.
So absolutely, and so I mean it is, and it's very congruent with all the stuff we were saying about deregulating Wall Street, letting the financialization of the economy, basically like let's give up on redistribution. Let's, but we can do other things, to make it a better society. So it's not quite conservatism, right? Like there's still some idea, like, like we got to do something to hold this like thing together. It's not like Darwinian dog eat dog, but yeah, like the material basis is the same as conservatism, and in some ways, I mean, like one thinks about the larger argument, like where like as I said, why the neoliberals are like more important, and I would say more dangerous than the neocons. Like, like you've always had, like, going since the days of Alexander Hamilton, you've always had American plutocrats that want the rich to get richer and, like, the poor to be marginalized, which is actually what Hamilton believed. Don't ignore the musical, please. But at various points, you've had like social movements, ranging from the populist to the CIO left, to the new left, that have pushed for against that, for an alternative politics, and the neoliberalism is to convince the Democrats, well, like that whole tradition of the populists, the tradition of the New Deal, the tradition of the Great Society, that was in the past. They had coal mines back then. We don't need that anymore. And so I mean, to the extent that has had an effect, I there's been some reversal of that. Not enough, but some. But to the extent that it did have an effect for many decades, that is a huge pernicious legacy, and it set the parameters of American politics. The left wing of the possible became basically the center right.
Right. Yeah. No, exactly. I mean, this is, you think about, there's, like you said, a sort of complicated incremental inching away from that, in the Biden era, but like, certainly as late as like the Obama presidency, right? There's like a moment that's burned into my mind from one of Obama's State of the Union addresses, where he says that the greatest anti-poverty program is a world-class education, which is just a perfect statement of this kind of progressive neoliberalism, right? That it's like, so never mind anti-poverty programs in the sense of like actually like lifting the floor for everybody, right? Like the only kind of anti-poverty we're interested in is greasing the wheels of upward mobility, right? Like,
that's right. I mean, to explain the sort of like the actual psychological appeal, because I mean the people who hold this politics don't think of themselves as bad people, right? And they are the A+ students that have succeeded. They're the students that get into Harvard, study with Marty Peretz, and through his social network, get jobs, working for Democratic administrations, or get good jobs in journalism. And so for them, like the system is great, right? And I think that the turn away from that is due to simple material causes, which is like like you get a world-class education and you're stuck with these student debts, and in the context of an economy where there are like no jobs, and you're basically going to have a lower standard of living than your parents. Well, like it's hard to believe that anymore. And so I think it's not a lot of people would still defend that politics, like on the liberal side of things. Even Marty Peretz. I mean, this is, I think, why I find him an interesting figure, because that period where he was on the left, where he was like, diligently reading Herbert Marcuse. Like that was a real thing. And like in 2016. I mean, it's partially because he hates Hillary Clinton because she snubbed him. But in 2016, he did support Bernie Sanders over Hillary Clinton, which I thought was an interesting thing. And I think that that's why I think this book is actually kind of interesting. It is the book of a sort of like a haunted man who realizes that he's done a lot of damage. It's like, basically
possibly the only person in Henry Kissinger's friend group to support Bernie over Hillary.
That's right. Yeah. I don't know if he would still support Bernie over Hillary. Has like reverted in a lot of ways, but I do think that there's a sense in which he has some awareness, more so than anyone else of that cohort, that like he things have gone wrong, and it's partially because things kind of ended up going wrong with him.
Things went wrong. Yeah. Okay. So like he has a And in fact, in that passage you quoted earlier, right? I mean, like he sort of mixes and matches the two, right? You know, he's still like I think my marriage is over is somewhere on his list of like woes, along with, you know, the war in Iraq was a disaster, and the financial system my friends helped build, you know, crashed,
and all these young people at Harvard think I'm a racist.
Yeah, all these young people at Harvard, this institution that means so much to me, just, you know, think, or saying I'm a racist fool. You know, and
no, this is actually, I mean, this is a good place to kind of like ending up at, because I'll tell listeners, and I actually will say, like, even though we made Marty Peretz sound like a horrible guy, I love the book. It's very entertaining. Not more entertaining, I think it actually illuminates the sort of, you know, social network that has done so much damage to America and the world. I've no better, like, sort of non-theoretical book that condemns neoliberalism as thoroughly as this book does. Inadvertently, I mean, perhaps.
You kind of say, right, it's like, look, he's getting factual issues, you know, very wrong in many cases, but like if you read it as essentially an unreliable narrator novel about neoliberalism, it's like brilliant and amazing.
No, it's the Lolita of neoliberalism. And having and it is that what makes it partially entertaining is that it's a rare case, you know, of actual, like, at least mortification or self-punishment or awareness of someone in the elite that things have gone wrong. And it is, you know, like, the basic story is, you know, like, first of all, you know, because he has all these high roller friends in Wall Street, you know, who are into junk bonds and stuff like that. You know, in the early 2000s, he invests heavily in the sort of tech bubble, something called the street.com by Jim Cramer, with Jim Cramer. And, you know, like, basically, you know, like, it's hard to lose money on the scale of, like, Ann Peretz had, right? Somehow this guy managed to do that. Also, and this is like, I wish there had been more about Ann Peretz, because I'm very curious about it, because it turns out that, you know, she says, well, she was against the war, but she was like an old peacenik from way back. And, and you know, like, wait, what? So this woman who's, you know, money you've been spending on this, like, you know, right-wing magazine that's been hugely militarist, that's been like all about American cultural hegemony and it supports every war, is a peacenik. And so they, you know, they divorce, and, you know, he's
which, by the way, let's just pause for half a second to appreciate the fact that his argument there is essentially, well, she, you know, she was against the war in Iraq all along, but you can't take that seriously because, like, you know, she was also against the war in Vietnam and Reagan's wars in Central America, right? You know,
that's right. No. And I mean, the other aspect of the marriage is he mentions, but he hated his father-in-law because his father-in-law, I believe Henry Davreau, was like, he was like an American diplomat, heavily involved with the United Nations, with UNRWA. He was like oversaw, like, the, you know, long-standing refugee program for Palestinians, and he and his father-in-law would always argue about this because, you know, like, his position is the Palestinians had to, you know, like, learn that they're a crushed nation, and the father-in-law would say, well, you know, like, I'm actually working with these refugees, and it's not quite like that. I just cannot imagine, like, what it would have been like to have been in that marriage where, you know, like, your husband is spending money on wars you don't support, arguing with your father because he's doing refugee work on behalf of Palestinians, and then he loses all your money, or not all your money, but like a big chunk of your money, and so he can't support the New Republic anymore, and he you know, tries to bring in these outside interests that, like, you know, take it off from him. Eventually it ends up in the hands of Chris Hughes of Facebook fortune, who takes it in a very different direction, but that's a different story. But basically, you know, he has some sort of comeuppance of some realization something has gone wrong, and that's a little bit gratifying, I have to say. But the other, and maybe the more darker flip side of this, though, is like, all during this period where, like, he's running this magazine, running it from the right, doing all sorts of very bad, sloppy things. And in addition to, like, you know, what stuff you mentioned, you know, he sponsored Stephen Glass, this, like, notorious fabulist who made up stories with a racial angle. Peretz would at meetings would say like, have you ever noticed that all the taxi cab drivers in Washington are like African from Africa? Why aren't Black Americans willing to do these jobs? And then Stephen Glass wrote this story where it's like he's in a cab with an African cab driver, and a black comes in, shares it, which I don't think ever happens, but robs the taxi cab driver, and the taxi cab driver goes on this long tirade about how blacks from America don't have a good work ethic. He's saying everything that Marty Peretz believes, right? All these
which is also amazing, because assuming that Peretz, didn't understand that this was made up, right? That like assuming that he was buying it all. Right, that means that he doesn't have a moment to pause and be like, wow, that's so weird that this thing illustrated the exact thing I was just complaining about actually happened to him. Okay, cool coincidence, let's publish it.
Yeah, there's a cover story. But during all this period, all these like very eminent liberal journalists who had gone to the masthead of big publications like the New Yorker and the New York Times Magazine, they all stood by Peretz, would defend him. As an example, like in 1992, Eric Alterman asked Michael Kinsley, about Peretz, is there anything he didn't like about Peretz? And Kinsley said, I have a problem with some of the needlessly vicious things about Arabs that we publish. So some of the needlessly vicious, like as opposed to appropriately vicious things. Like what a hero. But the moment Peretz, no longer had his wife's checking account, the moment he was divorced, suddenly like all these liberals are like, oh, Marty Peretz, he's not really a liberal. We never liked this guy. Himself around. I think that reflects much more shamefully.
I was just. I was just looking at the box of old New Republics, in my garage, and can you believe Marty Peretz says some really racist things? It's fucked up. Yeah.
Yeah. He got disassociated or disavowed by many people, and now, to the extent that he's never regained the perch that he's had. To the extent that he has a voice, it is in publications that are really of the right, like the Wall Street Journal or Tablet will occasionally publish him. On the other hand, I actually think that his type of politics, that sort of even the New Republic, even the liberal New Republic supports this conservative thing. There's a kind of still existing, very powerful strand within journalism that one finds of sort of contrarian thinking. What used to be called the slate pitch, which is really the New Republic pitch, which is like, I will defend a right-wing thing, but like on liberal grounds. So I'll say we liberals should actually think that the Roe v. Wade is bad, and it's best to leave it to the states or whatever. Like that style of journalism is still very powerful. One sees that, to name names like Jonathan Chait at New York, Matt Iglesias in Substack. There's a very powerful sort of what some people call reactionary centrism. That sensibility is still very prominent, and it serves a real interest. It exists because there's this like cohort of rich people who, for a variety of reasons, want to give to the Democrats, identify with the Democrats, but want the Democrats to be as right-wing as possible. And so for those people, reactionary contrarianism, it's always going to be like, something they'll pay for.
Yeah. At least in the at least in the Matt Iglesias case, I sort of enjoy reading his version of it, because he keeps using me as an example of like people with like ludicrous left-wing views that are too influential, and I like that view of the world. I think more people are reading things that I write in the Matt Iglesias version of reality than the real one. He wrote something in December where it said, if you want to participate in contemporary pro-Palestinian politics, you're supposed to agree with Yusuf Muniyar that the two-state solution is dead, and agree with Ben Burgis that from the river to the sea is nothing more than blah blah blah. So it's like, yeah, all right, I like it, and Matt Iglesias' worldview people have to agree with stuff I've written as as price of admission. I don't think that's true, but it's fun, right? It's
Yeah,
like
yeah.
it's the
Yeah, no, it's nice to have people who like vastly overestimate our influence on the world. But no,
yeah.
in any case, so yeah, I do actually think that like in or the Atlantic Monthly. I mean, I think the
Yeah,
Atlantic Monthly has a lot of the same sensibility of the old New Republic.
totally.
So I wouldn't want to say that like the kind of politics and sensibility that he crafted has totally disappeared. Like I think it's still a very potent force, and it's a potent force for the same reason that he had a big career. It's not just that he had a lot of money, but that he plugged into a social network
Yeah, I mean it's
of rich people that want to influence the Democratic Party.
right.
And in some
Yeah.
ways, I mean, like one thinks about it, like sociology. I mean, Democrats are a broad coalition. It does include always rich people, but it's also the case in some ways. I feel like you could almost compare it to something like Operation Gladio.
Yeah.
The idea is like once you had the division of the 60s, you had some Cold War liberals that moved to the Republican Party, but you had a few people that were left behind in order to wreak havoc on the side of the Democrats as a way of further strengthening the right. I think that's a kind of maybe a cynical way, but that's one way of looking at this.
Yeah, I mean, I think maybe the way to think about what you were saying just now is that the new, like the 90s New Republic, right, is like that's the sensibility they helped craft is still very much with us, but maybe it's been successful enough that like that early iteration of it like feels kind of antiquated and embarrassing in some ways, looking back to it, back on it, right? I mean, you mentioned that, they endorsed Joe Lieberman's campaign for president in
Yeah,
2014.
yeah.
So probably, the majority of people who voted for him had jobs at the New Republic, given the, given the performance of that campaign, but that's how trailblazers work a lot of times, right? That like their version of it, becomes like kind of passe, but like it's molded and becomes something that's much more successful.
Yeah, and so it's like kind of like the Lou Reed of neoliberalism.
Yeah.
Like the raw early version that later became watered down in many forms. Yeah, no, there's something to that. Yeah. Although I also think, I mean, in some ways we shouldn't.
Yeah.
I mean, you mentioned Joe Biden's move to the left, or attempts to
Sure.
placate the left are minimal, but there actually I think has been a real change in the Democratic Party. I think the sort of raw form of new republic style thinking is no longer, like, I don't think you can get away with that in quite the same degree. I think that the left is strong enough to at least like act as a check on that. And I just think I mean, it's interesting. I have sort of noticed. I mean, I was expecting. I mean, I'm very gratified by all the attention my piece has been getting. I was expecting some defenses of Marty Peretz, and aside from a few cranks on Twitter, I really haven't seen that. And that's kind of interesting. I mean, again, maybe it's because he no longer has the money that he once did.
Right.
But like it's the disavowed father, right? Like he is the
right.
He's the guy that created us all, but you can't quite admit him. He's kind of like the embarrassing ancestor, maybe like Jerry Lee Lewis, like hugely influential musician. But do you want to say, you might not want to praise him too loudly?
Yeah. Well, fair enough. You do praise the book though at the end for being like very irritated and sort of a maybe more than it's intended to be insightful window into into this kind of neoliberalism. You say Susan Sontag might not have thanked Marty Peretz, but you're willing to. So the article.
I'm encouraged. No, I think it is actually one of the best books on neoliberalism. It actually shows how this social network came together, the kind of influence it had, and the reason why even some of its own authors might feel some remorse about the world that they have created. So I recommend it.
All right, fair enough. So the article is called "Friends and Enemies: Marty Peretz, the Travails of American Liberalism," and since he is unlikely to marry another heiress at this point in his life. If you want to buy a copy of his book, it's called The Controversialist. So thank you so much, Jeet.
Thank you. It was great talking to you.
You have been watching free public content from Give Them an Argument. To access every single episode of the show, the main show on Monday nights, all of the streams, all of the debate breakdowns, all of the patron-exclusive post-games on Monday nights, all of the patron-exclusive bonus episodes every week, and much, much more, go to patreon.com/Ben Burgis. I cannot resist ending this with, don't be foolish.